For centuries, the Scythians have loomed large in the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and storytellers alike. Ancient Greek historians portrayed them as wild and fearsome warriors, galloping across the endless grasslands of Eurasia, wielding bows from horseback with deadly precision. To the Persians, they were a problem to be solved, untamable, ungovernable, and ever on the move. To the Chinese, they were part of a larger world of steppe nomads, living beyond the frontiers of the civilized world. But beyond the arrows, the horses, and the legends, one question has lingered. Who were the Scythians really? We know they dominated the Eurasian steppe for nearly 1,000 years, from about the 9th century BCE to the 2nd century CE. We've found their burial mounds, called kurgans, filled with gold, weapons, and intricate artworks. Their customs, tattoos, and weapons tell us much about their culture. But when it comes to their origins, the past has remained foggy. Until now. Thanks to groundbreaking work in ancient DNA analysis, scientists have been able to extract and decode genetic material from Scythian remains buried across thousands of miles, from Ukraine and southern Russia to Kazakhstan and Mongolia. And what they found is turning old theories upside down. Far from being a single ethnic group, the Scythians were something much more complex, a shifting web of tribes with diverse genetic roots stretching across continents. In this video, we're going to uncover how cutting-edge science has shed new light on one of the most mysterious civilizations of the ancient world. You'll discover what ancient DNA can tell us about the true origins of the Scythians, their cultural exchanges, and how their legacy still survives inside the genomes of people alive today. Let's begin. The Scythians were more than just mythic horsemen roaming the steppes. They were a powerful and far-reaching confederation of nomadic tribes that thrived between the 9th century BCE and 2nd century CE. Their domain stretched from the northern shores of the Black Sea all the way to the borders of China, forming one of the most extensive nomadic networks in the ancient world. But even in ancient times, defining who the Scythians really were wasn't easy. Greek historians like Herodotus described them with awe and mystery, portraying them as fierce, mobile, and nearly impossible to conquer. They were known for their unique lifestyle, living on horseback, mastering archery, and building no permanent cities. Instead, their identity was tied to movement, the land, and their kin-based social structures. They left behind no written records of their own. Much of what we know comes from outside observers and archaeological evidence, especially their kurgans, or burial mounds. These kurgans have been found across vast territories and have revealed not only weapons and armor, but also incredibly detailed goldwork, textiles, and even preserved bodies with elaborate tattoos. These discoveries suggest a people who were not only skilled warriors, but also deeply artistic and culturally rich. Their society was organized around clans and tribal units, and their wealth came from herding animals, raiding settled societies, and trading across enormous distances. They had contact with Greeks, Persians, Central Asians, and even early Chinese states. In fact, their ability to traverse these vast terrains made them important players in early transcontinental trade, precursors to what would later become the Silk Road. Interestingly, the word Scythian itself was more of a catch-all term used by ancient civilizations to describe a wide range of nomadic peoples who shared similar lifestyles. Just as the Greeks used barbarian for anyone non-Greek, Scythian came to apply to diverse groups that may not have all shared the same language, origin, or ethnicity. This broad categorization long obscured the true complexity behind the name. For a long time, scholars debated whether the Scythians were an ethnically unified group, or whether they were a loose confederation of culturally similar, but genetically distinct peoples. Were they originally from the West, closer to Eastern Europe, or did they migrate from the East, perhaps from regions around Siberia or even farther into Asia? That question remained unresolved for decades, mainly because of the limitations of archaeology and written sources. But now, thanks to ancient DNA analysis, scientists are finally able to peer into the biological lineage of these nomads. The findings are overturning old ideas and revealing a much more intricate tapestry of movement, integration, and adaptation. What emerges is a people who cannot be neatly boxed into one ancestry, or region. Instead, the Scythians were a dynamic blend, formed by centuries of migration, trade, warfare, and cultural fusion across the Great Steppe Corridor. For centuries, historians and archaeologists puzzled over the true origins of the Scythians. Were they Indo-European, Central Asian, a nomadic tribe from the east or the west? These questions lingered unanswered until ancient DNA entered the scene. In the last decade, scientists began extracting and analyzing DNA from Scythian skeletal remains buried across the vast steppe region, from Ukraine and Kazakhstan to southern Russia and Mongolia. What they found was both unexpected and revolutionary. The Scythians were not a single, unified ethnic group. Instead, they were a complex mosaic of diverse ancestries, shaped by waves of migration and centuries of cultural exchange. One of the earliest revelations came from studies of Iron Age remains found in the Altai Mountains, where some of the best-preserved Scythian mummies were discovered. The DNA of these individuals showed a mix of Western Eurasian steppe ancestry and Eastern Eurasian, what we now associate with modern-day Siberia and Mongolia. This strongly suggested that the Scythians, or at least some branches of them, had deep genetic ties to both Europe and East Asia. Then came discoveries from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region, often considered the Scythian heartland. Here, the DNA showed high levels of what scientists call Yamnaya ancestry, a genetic profile associated with the Indo-European steppe herders who migrated westward into Europe during the Bronze Age. But surprisingly, even these Scythian remains contained genetic signals from Central and even South Asia, pointing to centuries of contact with distant cultures. The most startling aspect of the DNA findings is just how varied Scythian populations were depending on where they lived. In the East, Scythians carried more East Asian genetic markers. In the West, more European ones. Yet despite these differences, they shared a remarkably similar material culture, suggesting that Scythian identity was more about lifestyle and tradition than biological lineage. Horse riding, nomadism, shared burial customs, and warrior culture were the unifying threads. Additionally, DNA analysis confirmed that Scythian society was not male-dominated in the way many assumed. Studies found that women were buried with weapons, and their bones often showed signs of having ridden horses and possibly fought in battles. Genetically and socially, the Scythians were far more egalitarian than many ancient civilizations. One of the biggest questions answered by genetics was how the Scythians maintained cultural cohesion across thousands of miles. The answer lies in their shared ancestry from earlier steppe populations and continuous mixing through trade and migration. They were in essence a living bridge between East and West. These findings have not only redefined who the Scythians were, but they've also added a new chapter to the story of human migration. The steppe was not an empty grassland. It was a bustling highway of peoples, goods, and ideas. The Scythians were both travelers and transmitters, carrying culture and genes across a continent. As more remains are tested, we're likely to uncover even deeper complexity. But what's clear already is this. The Scythians weren't just fierce nomads. They were genetic pioneers of the ancient world, woven from the threads of nearly every corner of Eurasia. If there's one thing the genetic record makes abundantly clear, it's that the Scythians were never a people of a single origin. Instead, they represented one of the most remarkable cases of East-West genetic fusion in the ancient world. For a long time, they were framed through simplistic lenses, either as Indo-European invaders or as Central Asian nomads. But ancient DNA now shows a deeper, more complex story, rooted in a long history of movement, interaction, and blending. The earliest genetic signatures in Scythian remains show a strong influence from the Yamnaya people, Bronze Age herders from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, often credited with spreading Indo-European languages into Europe. These early steppe pastoralists brought with them not only their language and technology, but also their DNA, which forms the backbone of many European populations today. This same Yamnaya ancestry is heavily present in Western Scythians, linking them to their steppe predecessors. However, the Eastern Scythians tell a very different story. Remains found in areas like the Altai Mountains and parts of modern Mongolia show substantial East Asian and Siberian genetic components. This includes ancestral links to populations related to the ancient peoples of northern China, the Baikal region, and even far northeast Asia. These findings suggest that while Scythian culture was widespread, it was not ethnically uniform. Different regional groups absorbed local peoples over time, adapting to their environments while still retaining core cultural elements, like horse riding, archery, and distinctive burial practices. This wide range of genetic inputs gave rise to a hybrid identity. Scythian DNA shows traces of ancient Central Asians, Iranian-related groups, and even South Asians in some samples. The steppe, it turns out, acted as a corridor rather than a barrier, with Scythians playing the role of connectors rather than conquerors. They served as intermediaries, linking cultures from the forests of Europe to the mountains of Asia. The diversity of the Scythian genome also reflects their openness to marriage alliances and social mobility. Nomadic life required adaptability, and in the harsh environments of the steppe, political cohesion often trumped ethnic purity. Genetic diversity was not a weakness, but a survival strategy. By blending with different groups, the Scythians strengthened their gene pool and broadened their cultural toolkit. Furthermore, this fusion shaped how they looked. Reconstructions based on ancient DNA suggest that Scythians likely had a wide range of physical features. Some had European traits, light hair and eyes, while others had more East Asian characteristics. This variability likely surprised ancient observers and adds another layer to their mystique. What we're seeing in the DNA of the Scythians is a rare case of long-term, large-scale integration. Unlike many ancient civilizations that imposed strict barriers between us and them, the Scythians were constantly reshaping themselves through contact and cooperation. Their blended origins speak to a time when identity was fluid and multiculturalism was, quite literally, in their blood. This remarkable hybridity makes the Scythians not just a case study in ancient genetics, but a powerful symbol of how human societies adapt, evolve, and endure through openness and exchange. The Scythians weren't just genetically diverse, they were deeply connected with their neighbors, engaging in a constant exchange of culture, goods, technologies, and genes. While they're often portrayed as wild, isolated horse nomads, the truth is much more dynamic. The Scythians were part of a vast, interactive web of civilizations stretching across Eurasia, and recent genetic studies confirm just how porous the boundaries between peoples truly were. One of the clearest examples of this interaction comes from their contact with the Persians and Medes. Archaeological findings show shared styles of weaponry, clothing, and even burial practices. But now, DNA evidence also reveals that intermarriage and integration occurred more than historians had assumed. Some Scythian graves show genetic signatures of Iranian-related ancestry, likely absorbed through long-standing alliances or movements along trade routes that connected the steppe with the great cities of the Near East. Further west, the Scythians interacted heavily with Greek colonies along the Black Sea. This contact wasn't just commercial, it was also social and biological. Skeletal remains from coastal regions in modern-day Ukraine show a mix of steppe and Mediterranean DNA, hinting at familial ties forged through diplomacy, migration, or even romantic unions. The fusion of Hellenistic and Scythian art found in burial mounds reinforces the idea that this wasn't a one-way exchange. Scythians influenced the Greeks as much as they were influenced in return. To the north and northeast, the Scythians also engaged with Finno-Ugric peoples, early Slavs, and Siberian tribes. In the Altai region, ancient DNA reveals mixtures with indigenous Siberians, showing how these steppe nomads were integrating people from forest and tundra zones into their society. This again challenges the stereotype of nomads as isolationist or tribal. Instead, Scythians acted as social and biological bridges across ecosystems and cultures. Even in warfare, the Scythians often left a genetic legacy. Raiding and conquest may have brought prisoners of war into their communities, who were then absorbed through forced or voluntary means. Women played a particularly important role in this process. Genetic studies show that Scythian women were often from varied backgrounds, suggesting that many came from outside the traditional steppe zone. Whether through alliance marriages, raids, or migration, the maternal lineage of Scythians shows high genetic diversity. Moreover, this mixing wasn't random. It seems the Scythians valued and even sought out skilled individuals from other cultures. Metallurgists, horse breeders, shamans, and traders likely found homes within Scythian camps regardless of their origin. In turn, the Scythians exported their innovations. Their saddle technologies, composite bows, and burial customs can be found far from their core territories. All of this paints a picture of the Scythians not as closed ethnic units, but as adaptable, open networks. Their genetic diversity was both a product and driver of their success. By building bridges with their neighbors, culturally and biologically, they didn't just survive on the steppe, they thrived. In a way, the Scythians were ancient globalization in motion, centuries ahead of their time. Their story is a reminder that identity is shaped not just by where we come from, but by who we choose to connect with along the way. Though the Scythians as a distinct culture eventually faded from the historical record, their legacy didn't vanish. It lives on, embedded in the DNA of modern populations across Eurasia. For centuries, scholars believed that once the Scythians were conquered or absorbed by emerging empires like the Sarmatians or Persians, their identity disappeared. But modern genetic science is telling a very different story. The Scythians may be gone in name, but their genes persist in surprising places. One of the most striking discoveries comes from modern Central Asian populations, particularly in Kazakhstan, southern Russia, and parts of Ukraine. These regions were once Scythia heartlands, and it's no coincidence that many people living there today still carry the same unique combination of genetic markers found in ancient Scythian remains, especially a mix of Eastern Eurasian and West Eurasian ancestry. Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA from modern Kazakh and Kalmyk populations, for example, reflect deep continuity with the Iron Age nomads of the steppe. Even in places like Hungary and Bulgaria, far west of the Scythian core territories, traces of Scythian-like ancestry have been detected. Some of this could be due to the later Sarmatian migrations, who shared close genetic ties with the Scythians and settled in the Carpathian Basin. Others may be remnants of ancient trade and intermarriage during the periods when Scythians engaged with Greek and Thracian societies. In the Caucasus region, geneticists have found a persistence of certain lineages common in Scythian samples, especially among Ossetians, a group historically linked to Sarmatian and Scythian descent. Linguistic and cultural elements in Ossetian traditions, including aspects of their mythology and warrior codes, also suggest a long-standing echo of steppe nomad heritage. Perhaps more surprisingly, modern Iranian populations, particularly in northern Iran, also show genetic continuity with Iron Age steppe peoples. This likely reflects the centuries of contact and blending between the Scythians and early Iranian civilizations. The name Saka, used in Persian sources to describe Scythians, hints at their long presence and integration into Persian history. But it's not just about DNA. Cultural influences attributed to Scythians, like certain burial customs, equestrian practices, and even styles of clothing, can still be traced in folk traditions across Eurasia. The iconic burial mounds, kurgans, found from Ukraine to Mongolia, have become archaeological landmarks that tell of shared ritual practices. Some modern communities still use similar burial symbols, echoing a past they might not even consciously remember. Importantly, the Scythians' genetic legacy also challenges simplified narratives of national origin. Countries today are often framed around fixed ethnic identities, but the persistence of Scythian ancestry across so many modern populations reveals just how mixed and mobile human history has always been. It reminds us that ancient peoples like the Scythians didn't just vanish, they became part of the genetic and cultural fabric of many societies. Ultimately, the story of the Scythians isn't about disappearance. It's about transformation. They may not have left behind cities or written texts, but their legacy is written in blood and bone, carried forward in the faces of people living today, across vast lands their horses once roamed. The discovery of Scythian DNA has done more than just trace the lineage of a long-lost people. It's revolutionizing how historians, archaeologists, and geneticists understand the entire prehistoric and early historic tapestry of Eurasia. These ancient nomads, once dismissed as little more than barbaric horsemen by their Greek and Persian contemporaries, are now central to a growing re-evaluation of cultural exchange, migration, and identity across the vast Eurasian steppe. Traditionally, Eurasian history was often viewed through the lens of sedentary empires, Rome, Persia, China, while nomadic groups were seen as marginal, disruptive, or transitory. The Scythians were rarely granted the status of civilization builders. But recent genetic evidence, alongside archaeological findings, has turned this narrative on its head. The Scythians were not only highly mobile, but also highly connected. Their genetic signature is a mosaic of West Eurasian, Siberian, and even East Asian elements, proof of how deeply integrated and dynamic the steppe zone was. By comparing ancient Scythian genomes with those of neighboring and later cultures, scientists have mapped intricate webs of migration and gene flow. We now see that the steppe wasn't a barrier between civilizations, it was a highway. Ideas, technologies, and people moved rapidly across this region, and the Scythians were both carriers and beneficiaries of this flow. Their gene pool shows admixture with Bronze Age steppe herders, early Iranian-speaking populations, and groups from the Altai and Siberian forests. This insight is rewriting the story of Indo-European language spread as well. Long linked to the Yamnaya and Andronovo cultures, the Indo-European expansion may have had significant contributions from Scythian-descended groups. The linguistic and cultural influence of Scythian-related nomads appears not only in Ironic languages, but also in place names, art styles, and religious motifs stretching from Eastern Europe to South Asia. Scythian DNA has also challenged long-held ideas about race and ethnicity in ancient contexts. While ancient texts often portrayed Scythians in essentialist or exotic terms, wild, fierce, alien, genetics reveals them to be strikingly interconnected with surrounding populations. They weren't outsiders, but participants in a wide and continuous web of human interaction. This nuance is crucial in today's world, where the misuse of ancient history and genetics for modern political agendas is common. The Scythian case warns us that identity in the past, like today, was fluid, evolving, and complex. Moreover, the technical achievements of the Scythians, their horse gear, metallurgy, and textile arts, are now better understood as part of a cultural continuum across Eurasia. The fact that similar genetic profiles appear in artisans, warriors, and traders found from the Black Sea to Western China suggests that the Scythians were not just nomads. They were innovators, connectors, and custodians of tradition. As more burial mounds are excavated and more genomes sequenced, the picture continues to grow richer. The Scythians are no longer seen as an isolated anomaly, but as a vital chapter in the story of how modern Eurasia came to be. Their DNA doesn't just tell us where they came from. It tells us how deeply their story runs through the veins of countless peoples today, making them one of the great hidden architects of Eurasian history. Long after the Scythians disappeared from the pages of written history, their genetic legacy continues to live on, not just in ancient bones unearthed from burial mounds, but in the DNA of modern populations across a vast swath of Eurasia. From Eastern Europe to Central Asia, traces of Scythian ancestry have been identified, woven subtly into the genomes of millions of people today. Thanks to advanced genomic sequencing, scientists have been able to map ancient Scythian DNA and compare it with modern genetic databases. The results are remarkable. Many contemporary populations, particularly in Ukraine, southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and even parts of the Caucasus and Iran, carry genetic markers that closely resemble those found in Scythian remains. This doesn't mean people in these regions are direct descendants of the Scythians in a pure line, but it does confirm that the Scythians intermarried, assimilated, and left behind an enduring genetic imprint. One of the most significant findings is how Scythian-related ancestry blends both Western and Eastern components. The Scythians were themselves a mix of Indo-European steppe herders, early Iranian-speaking groups, and indigenous Central Asian populations. This hybrid ancestry is still detectable in populations such as the Ossetians, an ethnic group in the Caucasus who speak an Ironic language and are believed by many scholars to be one of the closest living cultural and linguistic relatives of the Scythians. But the legacy goes beyond isolated ethnic groups. DNA analysis has shown that modern Slavic populations, particularly in Ukraine and southern Russia, contain varying degrees of Scythian-like genetic material. In Central Asia, Kazakh and Uzbek populations also exhibit genetic links to Scythian and Saka tribes, who were their predecessors on the steppe. Even among Hungarians, some studies have suggested trace components of steppe ancestry possibly tied to Scythian-era interactions and migrations. What makes this so fascinating is that the Scythians, though largely forgotten in mainstream narratives, turn out to be a genetic thread that ties together a diverse group of modern nations. They serve as a genetic bridge between Europe and Asia, a reminder that ancient history cannot be confined by today's borders or simplified into neat ethnic categories. Culturally, their legacy lives on in unexpected ways too. From motifs in metalwork to burial practices, echoes of Scythian traditions can still be found in the folk cultures of steppe and mountain communities. Their famed horse-riding prowess, their use of cannabis in rituals, and their fierce independence have entered mythic memory. But DNA confirms those myths were rooted in real, dynamic peoples. In the end, the Scythians were not a vanished people, but a formative one. They helped shape the genetic landscape of Eurasia, their genes spreading far and wide through migrations, alliances, and intermarriage. While their empire may have faded, their biological and cultural influence remains alive and traceable. Thanks to modern science, the Scythians are no longer just names in ancient texts or skeletal remains in barrows. They are part of the living story of humanity, written into our very blood.